Hi everyone, welcome to Open Democracy's weekly live discussion. My name is Nandini Archer. I'm the Global Commissioning Editor with Open Democracy. I work on the Gender and Sexuality team, mainly on feminist investigative journalism and stories of feminist resistance. And so for today, we want this conversation to involve as many of you as possible. So big, huge thank you to all of those who submitted your comments and your questions ahead of this discussion today. I will try and address as many of them as we can. So if you're joining on Zoom and you have a question or a comment for any of these amazing panelists, click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and type into that chat window. And people who are watching on Facebook Live can also put their questions in the video comments and I will manage to see them there. This week's topic is how are women journalists changing the world? And we're having this discussion to mark World Press Freedom Day, which is on Monday, because women all over the world face a backlash for the work that they do, but they haven't given up, thankfully. So today meet some of the women around the world resisting sexism and reporting from the front lines. So we have some really great panelists for you who will be able to speak about all different types of contexts and experiences. So without further ado, let me introduce them all. We have Banu Guven, journalist and former presenter for Turkish TV channel NTV. We also are joined by Zaina Erhaim, Syrian journalist and winner of the Press Freedom Prize. Also big welcome to Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wiczewska, who's a Polish freelance journalist based in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, as well as Sarah Clarke, who heads the Europe and Central Asia section of the group Article 19. And last but not least, a very exciting late edition, we have Corinne Vella from the Daphne Foundation. And to all the panelists, I'll ask you a couple of questions each, but also feel free to butt in if you want to follow on and answer a question that I've asked someone else. So to begin with, I was going to go to Banu to kick us off. I wanted to hear a bit about your background in journalism. So put quite simply, what got you into journalism in the first place?
So I'm from Turkey, and in Turkey, every now and then you have coup attempts or coups, and then the political scene is actually very lively. The issues we live in. I mean, I was maybe 15 years old when I decided I was going to be a journalist because I wanted to tell people what was really going on. Also, the Israeli-Palestine conflict was a very interesting issue for me. I wanted to understand more and tell more, but most of all, I was interested in the situation in my country because, you know, I was 12 years old when the coup happened in 1980, and then these were difficult times. And I visited a university. I went to university in the center of the city where all the political conflicts were to see every day, you know, like these were the conflicts. We see their consequences now, actually, unsolved conflicts of the Turkish Republic. So all these things were actually important factors for me to decide to do this job. Choose this job.
Thank you. And Zaina, you wrote a piece for us on Open Democracy this week, talking a bit about your background as a journalist and when you first spoke to your family about it. So what made you want to become a journalist, and what were some of those initial challenges you faced?
Yeah, actually, when I'm listening to Banu, I'm thinking, why, trying to remember how did I decide. I didn't even know any women journalists. I am considered by many as the first woman journalist who studied and worked as a journalist from my province. So I only had one example who was a friend of my mom, and she was living in UAE. And she also covered Iraqi war, and I was hearing some stories from her. I think maybe she played a role in that. The main difficulty is, I think we're not that far from some of the conservative Turkish communities. It is mainly being considered as men's job. You're not expected to do it. So when you do it, just choosing that major is a challenging idea. Especially for those who are like a bit religious community, they would consider you like, you're not supposed to be in public. Your voice is supposed to be forbidden from being in public. So the whole career is haram. It is forbidden for you to do. So then you need to worry. Everything that you do needs double energy compared to any man who decides to study this. To prove yourself, because you are usually not being taken as seriously, and then to be able to travel and to study, and then to be able to mix with men, to do interviews. Everything needs far more thinking and far more planning. And then eventually not to ruin your reputation, which might eventually get you killed in some conservative communities, because this doesn't belong to you personally, it belongs to the whole community. So this is just a glimpse about some of the considerations that any woman who decides to study journalism in our region, really, not just in Syria, has to think about.
Thank you. And I might go to Agnieszka next. I think you've recently faced quite a bit of heat for reporting in Uzbekistan. Could you tell us a bit more about what's happening here? Oh, and I think you're on mute.
Yeah, it was actually quite unexpected, because for the past 4 years we've seen a lot of changes when it comes to freedom of press, when it comes to freedom of speech, and recently the topic of LGBT rights came to the fore again, because the government is planning to change the qualification of the crime. I don't want to really get into details, but loads of people who over the past couple of years felt more freedom and kind of felt that it's okay to discuss difficult issues, started raising this issue. I was one of them, although I try not to. I never tried to be a sort of activist journalist in Uzbekistan, because obviously it's a conservative country. I'm a foreigner, I'm an outsider. So I've always tried to not to impose my views on local communities. But this time something really strange happened, and I was actually pushed into this discussion because one popular blogger who is known for his support for LGBT rights was heavily beaten. And then after I visited him in the hospital, my whole environment basically started being heavily persecuted by the security services, by the government. So I was kind of drawn into this whole conflict unintentionally, and it's continuing. To this day, I receive death threats. I receive loads of backlash from local people, but also different states, agencies. Also, I'm a teacher here at local university, and I teach media and cultural diversity. One of the topics we're discussing with our students is LGBT rights. So I don't know yet how it happened, but some parts of my lecture ended up on the internet. So you can imagine that it's not an easy time for me, because I'm being considered as this evil lady who came from abroad to destroy Uzbekistan.
Sounds extremely stressful.
Yeah.
We'll talk more about it. Yeah, really stressful. But thank you so much for joining us. And
it's okay.
And Corinne, thanks for joining us as well, and welcome. I wanted to talk a bit about your sister Daphne and what happened to her, and I was wondering if you could give, for those viewers who might not know much, a bit of background, and also whether you always thought when you were young that she would be a journalist. Was that always clear?
I'll start from your last question, because it's the easier one to talk about. No, it wasn't always clear, and it wasn't clear because women weren't journalists when we were growing up. Daphne was the first journalist to write in her own name. She was the first journalist to write her own column, and she was a woman. Women were largely confined to the sidelines of journalism, women's issues, that kind of thing. But there weren't women in newsrooms, and there weren't women writing columns, and there certainly weren't women writing columns in their own name. So she was quite new. And there was no example to follow when we were growing up. But that said, she always did like writing. She always did like reading. And I suppose if there had been role models when we were growing up, it is something she would have probably thought of doing. The other bit, which is harder to talk about, is that she was killed 3.5 years ago. She was killed right outside her own home, minutes after leaving her son at home. She was on her way to a bank. It was in broad daylight, and there was a bomb in her car, which she didn't know about. And it killed her. And ever since then, we've been pushing for people to be brought to justice. One of the ugliest things about her murder is that when you look back, you can see that it was always going to happen. Like things kind of had escalated just before she was killed. You know, there were more and more libel suits, there's more hostility, she was more and more isolated. And eventually the inevitable happened. And we had to push back against all the misinformation around her, which had been discredited so badly, you know, professionally, with her stories being challenged and criticized and being accused that she was making things up. So that was all the stuff we had to deal with when she was killed. It took a while for people to understand that she really was killed because of her work. And now we know for certain because people are being prosecuted for it, for her murder.
Thank you so much for sharing that. One of the questions from the audience actually ahead of the panel today was, they were wondering whether you could explain more about the work of the foundation and where the campaign is at now.
Well, the foundation works in two areas, largely speaking. One is that it's committed to keeping up the fight for justice because it's nowhere near done yet. People are being prosecuted, but nobody's being convicted except for one person who's actually admitted his part in the murder. And he only did that because he got a reduced sentence. We know that the case is still open, the police are still investigating, and it's a much bigger case than people might have understood initially. The other part of that, what we do at the foundation is to move beyond Daphne's case alone, which is to, it sounds ambitious, but to fix the system, as it were, to look at what's missing, what's broken, what needs to be fixed, and push for changes to be brought about. And that means, you know, legislation to protect journalists, but also mechanisms to protect journalists, not just in Malta, but across Europe.
Thank you. No, ambitious is good. And I'm going to move on to Sarah now. Given that you work for Article 19, perhaps you could provide us a bit of a kind of bird's eye view on everything. I don't know whether a lot of people view kind of women's rights and women in journalism as related to press freedom, but I was wondering if you could explain a bit why what we're talking about today is in fact a press freedom issue.
Well, the issue of the safety of female journalists has taken on increasing importance over the last number of years. I think in previous decades, women were seen as a minority, as a very small group of those journalists who were killed. And they remain about 10% of journalists who are killed each year. But the killings of journalists like Daphne, like Anna Politkovskaya, Natalia Stemirova in Russia, and many more in Latin America in particular, have really brought to the fore how vulnerable female journalists are, but more importantly, how powerful their reporting has been for which they're targeted. So we see in particular how it's female journalists who do so much of the crucial reporting on Indigenous rights, on children's rights, on migrants' rights, on corruption in the case of Daphne, but who also bring, you know, a global view on women's rights in general. The issue of online harassment and physical threats and attacks against female journalists has become a huge issue in the last number of years. we see that female journalists are targeted around 4 times more than their male counterparts for online harassment. And we know that around 73% of female journalists have received death threats, rape threats. Female journalists in particular experience threats against their children, as Daphne did, which is something that male journalists rarely have to deal with. And we see, that online harassment often spills into the physical sphere. So online harassment, which is often initiated by political leaders and powerful individuals, which then lays the ground for what we see as huge campaigns of doxing, pylons, very, very serious orchestrated campaigns of harassment against female journalists are often sanctioned and encouraged by political and business leaders. And they lay the groundwork, as they did in the case of Daphne and others, for physical threats, because online threats normalize the sense of violence and aggression towards female journalists. And then often, as we see in the case in Turkey, it isn't that Erdogan himself has to go after journalists themselves, but by his rhetoric, he encourages those members of the public who feel sanctioned and who feel supported in attacking and physically going after female journalists. So I think this is an issue that's unfortunately growing. That's both because the harassment itself is growing and the reporting of it is growing, because it's kind of notoriously underreported, the level of harassment that female journalists face. But it's an issue that press freedom and international governmental bodies and some governments are taking increasingly seriously because of the impact that it has on the female journalists. But not just that, because if you have a situation where a female journalist is silenced, you're not just depriving them of their freedom of expression, but of the public's right to information, which they simply will not receive. Some statistics, reference, 40% of female journalists have considered giving up because of the level of harassment that they face. Thankfully, many resist that and continue their work, including the amazing journalists here today. But that is only after really extreme harassment that I know that Banu and others have faced. So it's a huge sign of their bravery that they continue to do the reporting that they do.
I may add to Sarah. I think when she was speaking, it's not just that the dictators or the system is actually encouraging their supporters to attack women journalists. Some of the attacks are systematic, like what we've seen with the Saudi electronic army that was funded by the MBS and is being pushed. And also the difference, I think, which is the sexist approach for that kind of bullying. So for example, not just threatening them with the children, which Sarah has mentioned, but also using their private picture. So for a woman, a picture on the pool with a swimming pool is like a scandal, and it could her getting out of the field of her career. While for the man, it's very difficult. And also, I think one of the elements is what kind of things that they're challenging the women with. I've never been discussed about my idea or the facts that I mentioned or how credible my sources are. I'm always being questioned, whom have you slept with? Not to mention all the bad words that I get. Digging into my family, issues that even related to my daughter. So these things, which eventually, especially in our communities, which consider all of that as sacred, and they're blaming the women journalists because you're putting yourself in public, you're supposed to be bearing that. Instead, it's again blaming the victim instead of saying, no, what is happening to her is that wrong. And sadly, I know many of those 40% who questioned themselves and eventually decided, I don't want I can handle it on my own, but I don't want my family to go through this. And they eventually had to quit. And also the cyber attacks, breaking women's mobile phones, stealing their private messages, shaming them. This is also like a trend to, I think, silence specifically women journalists.
Thank you. It kind of leads on to one of the questions that came in from the audience ahead of the panel as well. And this was for Banu. What do you think stops women from becoming journalists, if anything? And has this kind of harassment ever made you think you don't want to be a journalist?
Well, I just became more and more stubborn, I would say. The more they attacked me, the more clear it was to me that I am going to continue doing my job as I should. But I have to admit that there were times where I was really tired of dealing with the situation. I mean, for example, once you try different things, like if it's about online harassment, the governing party in Turkey has lots of bot accounts. It's systematic, as Zaina described. They have their systematic online harassment campaigns vis-a-vis journalists like me or some other colleagues. And these are all sexist messages full with death threats and things like that. Then you try different things, like you go and file a complaint or many complaints, but don't get any positive reply to your efforts, if you try that way. And then you also write to Twitter. Like, I remember once I was sitting there and I reported about 200 tweets targeting me. And then I just had to turn off the computer and leave my phone behind me, and then went for a long walk and just thought about the whole thing. And when I was back home, I just continued doing my job. I was working on a story, I believe. And this happened because I had tweeted something critical about, some critical opinion about ministers. So at the beginning, when Zaina was talking, I also remembered how difficult it was for me at the beginning in 90s, and then especially on TV, to become the journalist I wanted to be, because you're always pushed into different sides and corners, like, you should better do this, you should better do that, don't go into conflict areas, or there are some jobs men think are better suited for us. So I had to fight my own way through this as well. There weren't too many TV personalities, like women anchors who were also editing their whole thing, your whole show and so on. And we've come a long way, but now, since things have changed in Turkey, so the media is, it's like a coup in terms of media, I would say. People call it media capture, yes, but we could also call it a media coup, because there are only a few channels which are really, almost niche, and a part of that, women journalists, if you want to be on TV and have a leading position, be an anchor, also you have to adopt the policy, adapt yourselves to the policies of the government, and you have to act like these men, adapt yourself to the patrimony and also to this militaristic approach. And all these things, I don't know what younger people now think, the younger generation thinks, I mean, women in the younger generation, when they, once upon a time, they used to dream of being a journalist, being on the TV, doing the job I do. But now, I don't think, because, I mean, only those who are in the same lines, reporting in the same line with the government, they would maybe dream of a career. It's such a difficult situation, but I also have to admit, as a last point maybe, we have many other outlets like on the internet and so on. So women journalists are very, very active in Turkey. And of course, especially rates of femicides. And also, you know that the president just decided by himself to leave the treaty, the European Convention Treaty against the violence, domestic violence. So in these times, it's very difficult, very important for female journalists to be present in the media and keep on reporting.
Great, thank you. And what about you, Agnieszka? One of my colleagues described you as certainly fearless. You also worked in Afghanistan, right? What were some of the challenges there, and has this kind of these attacks ever made you reconsider being a journalist?
So you are asking about Afghanistan or Uzbekistan?
You worked in Afghanistan as well, as far as I remember, but both. Yeah. Your experience in general.
Yeah, well, I haven't been to Afghanistan actually for a good couple of months. So as far as I know, the situation is getting really bad in there. I'm mostly now confined to Uzbekistan because I'm writing a book about the situation. I mean, the changes over the past couple of years. So I try not to report on anything else. You know, it's really hard to say anything because I'm now in the process of dealing with this trauma, let's say, of getting death threats and so on. And I'm not really afraid at the moment. I mean, I was a little bit surprised at first because I never expected that people would turn against me. You know, I was always this, you know, the only journalist, the only foreign journalist in Uzbekistan. And people were usually very friendly towards me. So this change really surprised me. But I kind of also surprised myself with the fact that I don't really care that much. I think I've become sort of immune to all the hate messages and all the possible threats that are awaiting me, you know, outside. I don't really check if, you know, there are some, you know, people standing in front of my window. I just pretend as if it's not happening. I'm also just trying to, you know, walk every day a couple of kilometers to just, you know, breathe, cook nicely for myself, like read interesting stuff. And it's kind of helping me to deal with the whole thing. I don't think that I would abandon journalism just because there are some threats. I mean, I think this is part of this job, unfortunately, these days, especially if you are writing about contentious issues, if you are writing about some, you know, if you are touching upon controversial topics. So I just take it as part of the job, and at the same time try to take care of myself, you know, in the process. So I make sure that I get good sleep, that I don't drink too much, that, you know, I walk and I eat well. So yeah, I mean, I don't consider leaving journalism, and if I can't stay here any longer, and it's possible because, you know, over the past months, basically every day something is happening. Every day it's either, you know, online harassment, or my friends are being questioned, or my boyfriend is being questioned by the security services, or I have a car accident, or you know, someone is posting a video of my lecture online, and then I receive death threats. Then, you know, some bloggers are talking about me and saying that I accused all Uzbek men of being gay, which obviously never happened. So, you know, every day there are some sorts of pressures, which, I mean, I don't really have any proofs, but what I believe is that probably security services are trying to get rid of me. I'm not leaving anywhere. I'm going to stay here. I might, you know, go for a holiday for a week, but no, I think that if this is all happening, it means I'm doing something right. So, you know, leaving would be really not the best option for me, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. And so I'm looking at a couple of other questions that came in from the audience earlier on. One of them, for anyone who feels like answering this, is there any way in which you feel being a woman is actually an advantage in journalism rather than a disadvantage in the work that you do and the stories that you focus on? Any thoughts?
I can take that if I may. I think while I was living in Rebel Held side of Syria, which was an active war, despite the extra difficulties that I had to face because I'm a woman, the restrictions in terms of clothes, having to have a male guardian on checkpoints and all of these things. However, I had the unique access for the sideline stories that I was mostly interested at because I was a woman. I was given permission to go into women's houses when they're on their own. This is something that no man journalist would be able to do. And I think it also gave me access to their thoughts, to their ideas, things that they wouldn't express with the men. And that's why I eventually, the only thing that I would consider I did during those 3 years when I was living in war, I didn't report. Well, once I had to report on a massacre because it happened next door, but I've never reported on the war, how many deaths, who captured what. I was mainly focusing on this extra things that women around me are facing, because I think if I wasn't reporting that, there was no one else who's going to be reporting it. And I felt like this is my mission. And unless I am a woman, I wouldn't have been able to do this, certainly. Neither feel it nor being able to report it.
Great, thank you. Another question that came in from the audience is, how do you think harassment of women journalists has got worse since social media? I think you touched on this, Sarah. Has it got worse since social media, or was it always there?
I mean, yes, it has gotten worse. Social media has both provided an incredible opportunity for female journalists to express themselves. But in terms of what we see year on year is a very serious rise in cases of online harassment. We launched a report just yesterday at the Council of Europe looking at threats to media across the region, and online harassment against female journalists is one of the sort of top 5 threats against journalists in the region. I think what we see is a real failure to address the issue, and that's a systematic failure. So we have a failure from social media companies to take the reports of online harassment seriously, to be transparent and accountable in how they deal with the reports, to act swiftly. We have a kind of a lacuna in the law in many countries where there simply isn't legislation in place with which prosecutions of online harassment can take place. I'm sure that's probably the case in Uzbekistan, Agnieszka, but that would be my sense. I'll put a little link in the chat on a resource guide that we've recently written with the OSCE to address online harassment against female journalists, and that's sort of a set of recommendations for governments, the judiciary, the police, and social media companies. But what we see across the board is a failure to take online harassment seriously. We see that with the judiciary and the police constantly. A failure of social media companies to really tackle the issue in a transparent way. and in a way that we've often seen harassment used as a pretext to remove content or to block users, when in fact that was legitimate speech. So we also see kind of the misuse of the online harassment issue to block critical speech, but also just like a total failure to prosecute. So we need judges and law enforcement to really be trained and to see through prosecutions. We've seen some prosecutions in places like Finland, France, and Ireland over the last 2 years. And so we're sort of using these as best practice. But honestly, when we were researching this huge resource guide, there were just so few cases of good practice for us to draw upon. So we're in a real moment of, you know, the issue is getting more and more serious. And at the same time, we don't have the tools to deal with it. So we're sort of scrambling to keep up and to deal with it.
Thank you. And I see, Banu, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I would like to add something. I live in Germany now. I work from here for Deutsche Welle Turkish and WDR. And well, when I want to report a tweet in Germany, I go and then there are some options, like it says, this tweet is against the law number this and this and this, or this. I mean, there are options. You really have to be a lawyer to know which one you have to choose, you know, like there are slight differences between two of them, or some article is mentioned. And then you go Google and check, and then maybe it could be this one. And, you know, I mean, there should be really something should be done about it, really. I mean, I don't know how it is in other countries, but, you know, it should be made easier, I believe. Thank you.
Yeah, it definitely should be made easier. Oh, and thanks. So Sarah, I see, is showing some materials in the chat for those that are interested. So another question is for Corinne. One of the things when Daphne was alive was that she had so many lawsuits against her, right? So one of the questions from the audience was, how do you think, or do you know how she coped with all of this intense pressure that I'm sure she must have felt?
Yes, when Daphne was killed, there were 47 lawsuits against her, and 5 of those were criminal lawsuits, which meant that the ultimate ambition of those suits was to have her put in prison. Those suits automatically collapsed at her death, because you can't prosecute somebody criminally when they're dead. But the other lawsuits, the civil ones, those were inherited by her family. And up until recently, more than 20 lawsuits were still active. Somebody filed 19 lawsuits against her, and he only recently withdrew them. And that was after years of hounding Daphne's family for money after she was killed. How did she cope? With great difficulty. It's an incredibly isolating experience to be the only one breaking stories and pursuing a story, even when people sort of hurl so much abuse at you and make it so difficult. But she did keep going, but it was very, very difficult. And now that we have taken on so much of the work of pushing back against all the abuse she faced and all the misinformation about her and all the attempts to discredit her, we only now really start to understand just how bad it was for her personally. She was dealing with all of this practically on her own. There was some support occasionally. There was the most egregious example was when one of the ministers in Malta at the time, he filed 2 lawsuits against her, and his assistant filed another 2. And they claimed on the false oath in court that she was lying about them. So they had the basis for having her bank accounts frozen. The day she was killed, she was on the way to the bank to try and sort out the problem. She had no access to her own bank account. It was incredible pressure, but the attempt to freeze her bank account and prevent her, from having any sort of financial autonomy, that created such a huge public backlash that somebody set up a fund for her, and they collected enough money to compensate for the garnishee order. They collected enough within 24 hours or so. Unfortunately, the garnishee order remained in place, and she still did not have access to her own money when she died. It is an incredibly vicious tool to use against a person, is to mount an attack by any form, online, offline, in the courts, harassing the person individually. It really is an isolating experience, and it makes the job very, very, very difficult. But it's something I wanted to mention earlier. When Agnieszka, you were speaking and you said you take it as part of your job. Don't assume that this is part of your job. This shouldn't be happening. It is not at all normal. It happens, and it happens regularly, but it is not part of your job. And no woman journalist should ever think that this kind of harassment in any form, even the supposedly harmless type, as they put it, because it's only happening online, that is not normal, and it is not part of your job. And you shouldn't be accepting it as part of a job. Because what happened in Daphne's case is that it became normalized that people would behave in this way towards her. And then it got worse and worse. And then the inevitable happened. And when you look back, it's like her son said, it was like watching a train crash in slow motion. It was always going to happen. And when you see online attacks accelerating, that can so easily spill over into a physical attack. It is an incredibly dangerous situation when you see that type of pile-on. I mean, Sarah can sort of talk quite a lot about that because she's got a much wider experience than I do. But it really is a bad thing when women journalists start to think that this is normal and that it is part of their work and that it's going to happen inevitably. It isn't normal at all, and it shouldn't be accepted as such.
Thank you. I wonder if anyone else has any thoughts on that.
Well, I can maybe reply because, well, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, this shouldn't be part of the experience at all. It's just that, unfortunately, there is nothing I can do, so it's either I continue with this job and either I continue what I'm doing or I just give up. So I really don't have a choice here. I mean, I wish I had a choice, but especially in Uzbekistan, where there is basically a non-existent legislation when it comes to, online harassment. And at the same time, things that I write about, for example, LGBT rights are officially banned in Uzbekistan. So, it's very difficult to kind of do anything to protect myself. I just can't. There is nothing I can do.
If I might give the opposite example, and it just happened yesterday, there is a Palestinian journalist whose name is Rawa. She was filming in Gaza in Palestine when a security person wasn't happy about her not wearing a headscarf in an area that he thought it's an Islamic area. And he asked her, why you're not wearing a headscarf? She said, it's none of your business. And then he hit her with a branch of an olive tree. He hit her so hard that she went to hospital. This is not the story. Well, she faced that mainly because she's a woman and she took specific personal decisions in her life. But then she decided to take a stand and to report him to the Interior Ministry. And since yesterday, the kind of bullying attacks and digging in her private pictures that had happened online to defend him is numerous. No one was actually bullying her online before that incident. But when she decided to stand up and to challenge that person, like even some private pictures for her and her fiancé, like just getting engaged in public, is becoming now like a thread, and nothing has happened, not an apology, not an investigation. So sometimes it might happen even vice versa. You're just doing your job, you're keeping low profile, you're just working on the ground, but then like the patriarchal community decide to see whether you fit with gender roles that they put to you, or you break them and you punish you, and then it goes on and on.
I think we should, I'm sorry, I have to jump in, Nandini, because Agnieszka, we have to, I'm glad that I learned about your situation now. Also, the journalists associations, RSF and so on, I don't know what they did until now, but your situation should be known, should be made public. And there should be an international support.
There is.
For you. So, I mean, yeah, I mean,
like probably most of the organizations supporting journalists around the world have written a statement about me. So it is a pretty high profile case, but at the same time, the local government doesn't really care. And also it's very difficult to identify who exactly is threatening me. Sometimes these are just, random trolls. Sometimes these are real people. I believe that in many cases, these are, bloggers supported by the security services or funded by the security service. You can't really identify a single source of threat at the moment. So again, I mentioned that I had a really strange car accident recently, and I don't really want to get paranoid, but to me, it didn't really look, it looked really strange because I was just like standing on the traffic lights and someone hit me in the back really hard without a reason, because I was just like standing, I was waiting on the traffic light. So yeah, it is all public, and loads of organizations, as I said, wrote a statement about me and about my situation, but it's just very little I can do. I can leave, and I can leave. I can go home for a week or two. But at the same time, I don't want to give anyone a satisfaction and show that these methods are working, because they aren't working. Yeah. I don't want those people who want me out to think that this is the right way to deal with journalists. So yeah, now I'm kind of sharing my personal view and my personal reflections on the whole situation, but I really don't know what to do. I kind of feel like I would like to leave for a week or two, but on the other hand, I don't really want to. So I don't know. I really don't know what to do. If you guys have any advice, then please share it.
Yeah, as Banu mentioned, obviously the NGO support can be useful, and your case is well known. But I think we need to increase the pressure on the Uzbek authorities. They do care a little bit about their international reputation. So there are certain levers that we can use. But I think, as Corinne said, it's that this is not normal. It shouldn't be taken as part of the job. And these are definitely escalating threats in your case that need to be taken really seriously. But I think that you're here talking about it as well is just demonstrates your bravery, and it is in itself, a shield. It's very important that we keep talking and raising these cases, because that does give you protection.
Yeah, I hope so.
Thank you. We will have to start wrapping up soon, but to kind of end with, I guess I was going to ask the panelists, and quite a few audience members asked this ahead of the panel as well. Are you feeling hopeful about the future of journalism in general, and specifically women in journalism in your contexts? I can go to Zaina first.
That's a difficult question. I'm usually not an optimistic person, but I feel in the last couple of years, with the kind of challenges that I faced, I was only able to count on women journalists and feminists to give me hope, to be able to go on and to keep working. And this is what I'm trying to do. I'm also trying to be that mentor, help, colleague, whatever for other women journalists, because I think without each other, then I wouldn't have any hope. But now my only hope is this dedication and this sisterhood that is there. We do know the extra things that we face because who we are. And I think I am seeing some movements for women to women, trying to support the women journalists. And I'm hopeful for this.
Thank you. And Banu, are you feeling hopeful?
Well, of course I'm hopeful, because look at us. I mean, we're here, we're talking, we're still there where we want to be, and we're still doing our job. Like, I have so many colleagues, female colleagues in Turkey, who also had to face lawsuits or threats, and who have been dismissed from their jobs. But we keep going on. I mean, like, and there is also a growing solidarity. And I believe that like the women journalists also feel like being women is about everything, you know? So therefore, in these difficult times, especially when we feel this enormous pressure of the patriarchal conservative government in Turkey, we get together more. I mean, even if this time, I mean, pandemic times, because of pandemic, etc., makes it more difficult for people to get together. In Turkey, you see these, maybe you've seen the demonstrations against the decision of the president to leave the convention against the Istanbul Convention against violence against women. So we're still reporting, critically, and we are also supporting each other in different lawsuits. So, and I see my colleagues like Agnieszka and Zaina. I mean, we are inspiring each other too. And so I have more hope. Yeah. And also thanks for the work of NGOs. Yeah, it gives us also more hope. Thank you.
Thank you. And Corinne, any final thoughts?
Well, if I didn't have any hope before, I certainly have some now, having heard everybody today. Yes, I am hopeful. I am hopeful because there's never been a more important time for journalism. There are so many changes going on across the world. There are so many things happening in supposedly safe areas like the European Union. We've seen journalists killed here. Daphne wasn't, unfortunately, not the only one. There is a huge need for good, more and better journalism. And as Zainab explained, women can go places that many men can't go, and tell important stories that would otherwise not be told. And it's encouraging to see that there are good, strong women who continue to do that despite all the obstacles they face. So yes, I am hopeful.
Thank you. Okay, Agnieszka, any final words?
I can just agree with what everyone has said so far. Like, I'm also hopeful because there is so much solidarity between journalists, but especially between women journalists. And I feel it a lot these days, especially. I've received lots of support from my colleagues. So yeah, this gives me hope. But unfortunately, I don't think that the work itself is becoming easier. The work itself is becoming more difficult, but the support is definitely better than it was a few years ago.
Thanks. Okay, Sarah, any final words before we wrap up?
Just that I'm hopeful because we're seeing a lot of momentum building, let's say, at the EU level and beyond, recognizing the work of Daphne and of others, and that this has been translated or is being translated into real legislative reform, for example, in the case of abusive lawsuits. And that came directly from the advocacy of Daphne's family. So I think the international community is taking journalism more seriously. They're waking up to the issue of violence and online harassment of female journalists, because it can't be ignored. But I think we have a long way to go, and we need to really keep up the momentum.
Great, thank you. And thanks so much to everyone. I'm afraid we do have to wrap up now. But it was really great to hear from all of you, and it's always great to hear about like all your fantastic work. And I'm sure we'll keep track on and up to date on your case, Agnieszka, and how things are going. So thanks so much also to the audience and all your questions. And sorry if I didn't get through all of them, but hopefully we'll carry on the discussion online. And happy World Press Freedom Day, everyone, if that's a thing. We do have a weekly debate, so you can check our website and our social media. And my colleague will put more details in the chat. And if you're interested in feminist investigative journalism in particular, go to opendemocracy.net/tracking the backlash. And Open Democracy does rely on contributions and donations. So if you want to see more public interest journalism like this, please do support Open Democracy. And my colleague will put the link in the chat to that as well. Thank you all again, and hopefully see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.